The Russian forces continue capturing several positions to the southwest of Myrnohrad, gaining control over additional fortifications and advancing along the railway line towards the city. Russians, with the capture of these fortifications, continue pushing the Ukrainians out of the pocket, up through the corridor, and out of the encirclement. What the Russians are at the same time doing is minimizing the size of this corridor to attack the flanks of it, putting them in a narrow one that is mostly centered around open fields. As we see with the recent push, the Russians pushed the Ukrainians out of Lysivka and Sukhayar up towards the railway line and up towards Myrnohrad, where at the same time the Russians pushed through the southern parts of Myrnohrad to reach the apartment complex area and cut it off from the south and gain control over the positions within the city itself to prevent the Ukrainians from withdrawing into the city, and instead being forced to withdraw alongside the railway line, forest lines and open fields towards the northern parts of Myrnohrad, to which the Russians continue pushing in the eastern direction from the Pokrovsk direction, cutting off the western roads, leaving just a single forest line for the Ukrainians to go through to reach Myrnohrad in the northern parts of the city, which means the Russian reconnaissance over the area is able to constantly detect and strike Ukrainian forces withdrawing through the corridor. The capture of these positions south of Myrnohrad allows the Russians to have two railway connections between Novohradivka and Myrnohrad, the eastern and western railway lines. This allows the Russians to directly supply their forces from the Novohradivka direction, and this is a significant strengthening of their supplies going into Myrnohrad, as the Russians have Novohradivka as a significant logistical hub, comparable to Selidove further south, which has been supplying the western flank of Pokrovsk and Pokrovsk itself. This means the Russian forces have significantly strengthened and improved their supply situation for their forces here to the south of Myrnohrad, and with the capture of the fortifications, the road is directly open into the city, where the Russians can continue advancing through the city itself. The Russian push from the northern flank has limited supplies, and the roads are mostly open and exposed. This means the Russian push will mainly come from the south as the fighting continues. At the same time, they've been clearing the apartment complex area in the eastern part of the city. Consolidating the positions there and pushing through the central apartment complex area will allow the Russians to connect their forces between the east and the south, allowing for additional roads leading into Myrnohrad from the southeast. Finally, the Russians will be pushing through the central parts of the city, combining their forces from the north, east and south to push the Ukrainians back out of the final section. The positions in between Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk are in a very dangerous positions. The majority of the soldiers withdrawing from the southern parts of Myrnohrad will not be surviving the exit through the pocket, and if they manage to make it to the end, they still have to cover a large field out in the open with no cover from Russian drones and direct fire from Pokrovsk itself and the northern flank in the direction of Rodinsk. The Russian push through the railway here east of Pokrovsk allowed them to capture some fortified positions and through the mall area and up towards the rear of Rivne, cutting off the road connection between Myrnohrad and Rivne. The Russians are also here working through these settlements to gain control of them and further limit the exit route from Myrnohrad through the railway in the north and out of the pocket. Leaving the pocket open means that when the Russians are putting pressure on the Ukrainians and they cannot hold their positions, he'll end up having to withdraw through the open gap, because fighting without supplies at a very difficult position under heavy fire, you still have a higher chance of surviving by withdrawing, and this is classic art of war. Leave and exit. If you close the exit, and then the ones encircled will fight until the end. So it is a much tougher battle if the Russians close the pocket, yet the ones surviving will not be a lot from such a narrow corridor. To the northeast, in the direction of Siversk, the Russians managed to gain full control over Svenivka and push through to gain control over the farm area in the central parts and up along the railway to reach and connect with Siversk from the south. With this, the Russians have full control over both railway lines leading into Siversk from the southern direction, and with the capture of the positions here along the open fields west of the eastern railway line, the Russians have fully secured this road for their forces moving into Siversk. Of course, Ukrainians can still use drones, artillery, and long-range strikes on those forces. However, without direct fire control, the Russian forces able to enter Siversk has significantly increased, and the supplies going there has also significantly increased, with control over the eastern road, positions on the northern flank, and control over the southern railway. The Russians now have positions along Siversk from the northern, eastern, and southern directions, and have entered into the town from the south and east. The full capture of Svanivka allows the Russians to have control over the Bakhmutovka River leading up towards Siversk itself. With the river line as the western flank, they also have a solid defensive position alongside it, and they have close proximity to the roads leading out of Siversk to the south. And with the close proximity to the roads in the north, the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw through the open roads, where Russian forces can fly drones around the clock. Therefore, any Ukrainian forces withdrawing from Siversk will also be targeted by Russian forces both on the southern and western highway and in between. As for any attempts to resupply the forces through these highways and roads, then the Russians will also be striking those, which means that the situation around Siversk has been reversed, with the Ukrainians having to move through open fields to resupply their forces and withdraw through these open fields, while the Russians have cover in their forest lines and the capture of the fortifications to push through into Siversk from the east. But again, as long as the Ukrainians hold control over these fortifications on the western flank of Siversk, located on the high ground, then it will be difficult for the Russians to gain full control over Siversk. Therefore, fighting will likely be centered around these fortifications rather than the town itself in the coming days. As for the Yampil direction, the Russians consider offensive operations throughout the town, where they're looking to gain full control of it, slowly pushing through it and clearing the buildings from Ukrainian forces, before moving further south to gain full control over the highway on the western bank of the Sverska-Donetsk River. On the eastern bank of the Usk River line, the Russians managed to gain control over some forest lines here to the south of the fortifications near Novoplatonivka. This is an interesting development, as it is a move in between the two defensive lines. The first line of defense just outside of Borova, and the second line of defense north of Novoplatonivka. The Russians are already pushing through the fortifications to the north, and the first defensive line here to the north of Novoplatonivka, to which the Russians is pushing through from the eastern flank. But with this push along the forest lines, they're looking to cut off the supplies going to the fortifications and flank it from the rear to strengthen the offensive operations in that direction. However, it also puts them in a difficult position, because the Ukrainians can counterattack from multiple directions to cut off the supplies or threaten their supplies, which would weaken the forces operating at the front line. Therefore, it will be interesting to see what the greater plan of the Russians are with this push, if they're able to cut off the supplies to Novoplatonivka, gain control over the town, or gain control over the fortifications to then push into the town and cut off the connection to the Ukrainian forces operating within Bohuslavka and Novokrodyakivka to then consolidate their positions, or if the Ukrainians are able to counterattack and disrupt such an operation by the Russians by pushing in the northern direction. In the Kupiansk direction, according to Putin, he had a meeting with the military staff and went to the Zapat headquarters in Ukraine. During that meeting, according to Putin himself, 15 Ukrainian battalions are encircled in the Kupiansk direction. Naturally, there's no way to verify this information, but it is a fact that the Ukrainian forces operating east of the Usk River line in the vicinity of Kupiansk has a very limited supply line, as the Russian forces are constantly striking the bridges across the Usk River line. Any pontoon bridge being set up is struck by Russian forces. Drones are flying around the river line to detect any Ukrainian crossing, and MLRS strikes follow up by striking those crossings. So based on this, it is very limited supplies that goes east of the Usk River line. And if the number of Ukrainian soldiers truly is 15 battalions, then it is a significant amount of forces that the Ukrainians have on the eastern bank of the Usk River line under these supply situations, which explains why the Ukrainians are so desperately counterattacking in the direction of Kupiansk to try and free up the supply lines for the forces operating east of the Usk River line. And this again is another example of how Ukraine truly refuses to withdraw regardless of the situation. We saw it in Myrnohrad, we saw it in many other areas, and now we're seeing it in the Kupiansk direction. It makes no sense not to withdraw from an area that is clearly lost based on the developments to the north. Even if they withdrew their forces east of the Uskar River line, it is likely that they'll be able to recapture the western parts of the Uskar River line had they pulled them out before they lost Kupiansk. Or at the very least, have saved these potentially 15 battalions. If fully manned, this would be 15,000 soldiers, but it is unlikely that there would be more than 50% or so manned based on numbers that has come out since. This means about 7,000 to 10,000 soldiers would be encircled in the eastern bank of the Uskar River line if these numbers are accurate. As for the southern section of the front line in the Zaporizhzhia-Dnipropetrovsk region, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over Danilivka here along the Yanchur River. With this counterattack, the Ukrainians have yet again freed up the direct control over the highway connecting Pokrovsk with Hulyapole further south. But as we previously mentioned, the Russians are advancing alongside the highway itself in western direction from the Yanchur River, where they're looking to gain full fire control over the entire highway, which means even if the Ukrainians recapture their positions in the area, the Russians will be able to threaten the highway itself. I also previously put doubt on the ability for the Russians to push us through to gain control over these settlements east of the defensive line, because again, the defensive line is very well fortified. Defensive fortifications, anti-tank dishes and dragon teeth, preventing a breakthrough by the Russians, and the Ukrainians would be able to resupply their forces on their side of the defensive line and strike any operations by the Russians and have direct fire control over these settlements. Instead, the Russians would need to push through the rear of the defensive line as they have been, pushing through the side of it to gain control over the fortifications and settlements, and then push through to the rear of the defensive line and gain control over the settlements along the highway by pushing through the weak spots, as they have been further east. With this, we see offensive operations by the Russians in the direction of Tychy and Kolomytsky, where they're looking to gain full control over the Vovcha River line to the north, all the way up towards Pokrovsk, and cut off the connection of Ukrainian forces between Pokrovsk and Vidradne, essentially blowing up the bridge here south of Pokrovsk to isolate it from the positions to the south, as well as the bridge across Piansy here to the west towards Novomykolivka, and then advance alongside the roads down south towards the defensive line and down towards Hulyapole from the north. As for the south, the Russians managed to gain control over additional fortifications along the northern flank of Satisha, along the road down towards Hulyapole, and gain control over the northern street here within Satisha, consolidating their positions in the area and continuing the offensive operations north of the river line, where they're pushing through the north of the river line before pushing down south towards the fortifications along the eastern flank of Hulyapole until they consolidate the positions within Zelenihai and Vysoke. Then any push from the east would be unreasonable, and they're concentrating their forces on the northern bank of the river line to split up the Ukrainian defenses into parts, allowing them to strike one section at a time. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, share on my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.